It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's guest to you, Peter Bartu. Peter has a wealth of knowledge on the political situation in Iraq and is an expert in political transitions, very helpful in the Middle East. And previously, he was also an advisor to the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process. And served as a foreign policy advisor in the Australian Prime Minister's office. Welcome.
Thank you. Delighted to be here. Thanks for coming out on a Monday night.
So it's a very exciting time to talk about this. And as I was looking over what to say today, the news kept happening on this region in particularly with the UN session getting started. But this is about Iraq after ISIS, and right now, I guess we're 2 months after the fall of ISIS in Mosul, the biggest fight of that war. But let's go back a little bit before that. Peter, you were actually in Iraq, in Mosul, near Mosul, in the February or January of this?
November. Last year, that's right. I'd been asked to go up and work on transitional governance arrangements in Mosul and Nineveh governorate after ISIS would be, ejected from Mosul. This was a time when people thought that process would happen a lot more quickly than it eventually did. And clearly it's only just now that we've seen Mosul and another place to its west called Tal Afar that have finally been liberated. But let's not forget, while tonight's topic is Iraq after ISIS, ISIS hasn't completely gone yet. In fact, there's a large presence in Kirkuk Governorate in Norwegia, which has still yet to be cleared. And one of the reasons why there's been a delay on that is the politics of how and when this will happen haven't quite been worked out between all of the protagonists in the coalition fighting against ISIS.
So how, in the run-up to the fighting, or during the fighting, how were things divided at the time? Obviously, there's at least three major players: the Kurds, the Sunnis, the ISIS, and the Shia Iraqi military.
Right. So in bringing together everyone to the party or into the coalition to actually deal with ISIS in Iraq, you had the international coalition of some 50 different members, some playing larger roles than others. The US with 5,000 to 6,000 troops, for example. You had the Kurdish Peshmerga in the north, coming from the north, looking after its areas. And extending towards agreed lines. You had many of the PMF militias that were formed in late 2014 because of a fatwa by Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani, who came forward and participated in a lot of the fighting. And all of these protagonists, of course, are still there. That's the simple version. And while they could all agree on what they wanted to do together, i.e. get rid of ISIS, they did not know, they couldn't agree in advance who would take control of these areas after the fighting had ceased. And that tension has animated both the conflict until now and has emerged front and central, which we'll talk further about.
Sure. Yeah. I think one obvious question is at that point in the fighting, there's been a little bit of vagueness over the role that the U.S. military was playing, obviously with the Iraqi forces, an advisory role. It's been described as. How advisory is it versus actual?
Well, I think the US, the UK, the Australians, the Canadians, in particular, have been playing key roles in both. On the ground, special forces advice, air support, artillery support, in pretty much every way. There's also been an extraordinary coalition, I should add, of NGOs, UN agencies and so forth that have been doing extraordinary work in dealing with IDPs, refugees, the humanitarian fallout from what have been quite brutal battles to clear these cities. You've got 2 to 3 million people displaced right across the country, and it's a very unusual and interesting to have humanitarian, UN, others working so closely and to the fighting between all of these actors.
Yeah, I think the U.S. military, numerous people have said that the battle over Mosul was devastating, one of the most horrific urban warfare fighting battles.
Sure. Yeah, and that's the story, unfortunately, with most of the other Iraqi Sunni cities and what's happening in Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa on the Syrian side too. The fighting has been Stalingrad-esque. I think that's a totally fitting analogy, in fact. And you only have to look at some of the footage coming out of these cities as to how tough and difficult it has been, which means it's going to take a lot of work to reconstruct, rebuild, etc. Yeah.
So again, so here we are at the end, but actually maybe this is even more difficult. And you went back to find out what would happen now 2 years prior, is that right? 2009, sorry, a while prior.
Sure. So no, I was actually in Iraq for 18 months, 2008 to 2009, looking very specifically at all of the areas that are disputed between the Arabs and the Kurds. And this is a fault line that runs from the Syrian border down to the border with Iran. It has as its epicenter Kirkuk, but it also includes many Mosul, parts of Nineveh Plains, Sinjar on the border with Syria. And this is the issue that's coming forward again in terms of the Kurdish regional government president, Masoud Barzani, and some of the Kurdish leaders have called for an imminent referendum on Kurdish independence on the 25th of September, and they want to draw their line, their southern boundary with the rest of Iraq. So I was asked to go back based on that experience and knowing these areas to see what the post-ISIL phase would look like.
Is that the right plan?
A couple of observations are noteworthy, I think. One is that the Iraq of 2008-2009 is a different Iraq today. And the apocalyptic experience of both the fighting and the experience under ISIS has had long-term impacts on the three major communities in Iraq. The Sunni are atomized, even the Kurds are very fragmented, the Shia are divided, in a way that was not immediately apparent in 2008-2009, when there was a greater level of coherence on everything related to Iraq, notwithstanding the Sunni-Shia civil war at the time. So it's a little bit more complicated now, and then there's a lot more things to repair and fix.
And is that just because time passes? I mean, obviously there was close after the war in Iraq in 2009. What do you think happened between that time? Obviously ISIS.
Right. So well, the emergence of ISIS in 2014 was probably the most dramatic manifestation of the changes that had emerged after 2011, the Arab uprisings, the Syrian civil war, the spillover from Iraq back into Syria. And of course, what we've all been watching unfold over the last 12, 14 months. So, the kinetic energy, the destruction, the, experiences, Yazidi genocide, the enslavement of Yazidi women, it's a lot. There's, very traumatic. And the question is, having now nearly defeated ISIS, what's the most pragmatic or stable way forward to prevent further conflict and to, attempt reconstruction, to attempt to facilitate the return of 2 to 3 million IDPs and refugees back to their points of their homes.
All right.
So there's 10 years of work here.
So I'm guessing, and I mean, it seems like the Kurds have been such a stabilizing force in all of this. A referendum literally pulling out of what is Iraq for Kurdistan could be devastating. Is that right? And can they even do that?
Right. Well, it's it's easy on the one hand to feel quite empathetic and sympathetic to Kurdish desires to be independent. And I think that's, they've been very generous in hosting IDPs. They've played their share in the fight against ISIS. They, more than any other component in Iraq, supported the post-2003 arrangements because they benefited from them. But I should say that, again, we're not in a very stable moment, as you correctly mentioned. It is a gambit, but it's a real one. And we know this because Turkey and Iran are getting involved now and advising Masoud Barzani to pull back. This is not a good idea. People are working behind the scenes to, look at ways of accommodating eventually what the Kurds want. But again, there's a couple of quick points here. One is, when is the right time to do this exercise? Should it be after the IDPs have gone home and after reconstruction has happened and after some kind of regularisation of this myriad of forces that have come together into the battle against ISIS goes back, and, rather than you've got everyone's armed and on the battlefield still, while the suggestion of holding this referendum on the 25th has come forward, and it's already sparking exchanges up and down that fault line that I described, which is not good. We could easily roll into a larger conflagration that could be completely from unintended consequence, which no one really wanted to happen in the first place. So there are, one is to say to the Kurds, look, just be patient, let's deal with this other stuff first, and your time will come. Well, they would say, look, you've been telling us this for 100 years now, and we've certainly had this for the last 15 years, and for Masoud Barzani, the notion that you would wait for normalcy to return doesn't make much sense. You can use the crisis, in a way to your advantage. The problem is that, as I mentioned earlier, all of these different communities in Iraq, we can't talk of them as homogenous entities, and there are rival factions within the Kurdish polity, some of whom are coming down from Turkey, some of which are coming over from Syria, that are engaged in different ways. There's, again, a question that this might not be the right time for this.
Possibly a referendum wouldn't even make it through.
Well, I mean, I think if there was a prospect, I think they'd get overwhelming support from most the Kurdish population. But the fact of the matter is that the Kurds have mismanaged their economic circumstances quite badly over the last 15 years. Many of their institutions have been in a state of suspended animation. Their parliament hasn't met for a couple of years. The mandate for Masoud Barzani legally terminated 18 months ago. So there's this. Some of the Kurdish factions are saying we need to get our house in order first before you play this card of delivering the revolutionary independence we've all sought. They're concerned about a family takeover of the Iraqi Kurdistan. This is a real tricky dimension.
So they get out of it by kicking the can down the road a bit?
Well, that's a worn and tried and tested process, particularly with this issue, I have to say. But there are, there's a couple of ways of dealing with this, I think. One is there is actually a constitutional pathway in the 2005 Iraqi constitution, Article 140, which deals with these questions. Normalisation of the environment, the conduct of a census to register everybody, and then a referendum so that they can decide if they want to be a part of Kurdistan or not. I must say that there are several levels of this problem in play here. One is the three governorates that are recognised as the Kurdistan region. Duhok, Erbil, Sulaymaniyah. I don't think anyone has got any problem with these being, and they are recognised as Kurdish, and the Kurds have got the most expansive autonomy arrangements anywhere on the planet. It doesn't get any better. If they were more autonomous, they would already be independent. So what does concern people, and here I'm talking about Iraqi Arabs and Turkmen and Christians and Yazidis and non-Kurds who are involved in these disputed areas which have equally strong claims that they're not Kurdish areas. And they'll go to war over that. And Kirkuk is in the centre of this. So just as much as the Kurds feel that these are their historic areas, the other components feel equally strongly that they're not. And one can argue actually that there's a current in the emergence of ISIS in the areas that it deployed to and where it came into that was tackling part of this issue. So, kicking it down the road, it's not a bad idea.
The preferred path. There was something you mentioned earlier when we were chatting that I found interesting. Obviously, ISIS had been funding a lot of their operations through oil and gas gained illicitly, and Kurdistan's success largely has been based on a very rich oil economy. You had some interesting stories about how that economy worked in a practical sense.
Sure. So Iraqi Kurdistan did very, very well post-2003 in both negotiating its autonomy and the price on which it would stay as part of Iraq. One part of that economic incentive was that it would get 17% of the Iraqi national budget per annum passed as direct revenues to the Kurdistan regional government, and they'd be free to spend it how they saw fit when their population is meant to, or is seen to be about 13.8, 14%. So they got a 3% bonus in terms of what was revenues were provided. All oil and gas revenues in Iraq are the property of the Iraqi people, whether those reserves are in Kurdistan or elsewhere in the country. And in theory, all the revenues are meant to come in centrally and then dispersed along the lines of that formula that I described. Now, because, if you've been to some of these areas, the oil is literally seeping out of the ground. So the prospects for leakage and people making a few extra dollars on the side is immense, which has been aggravated by, the conflict of the last 14 months in particular. I guess what I'm saying here is that there's a lot of smuggling going on. It goes north, south, west, and east. If we could go underground, it would. There's
people just literally. You explained with milk canisters, empty ones. Don't mix your oil with your milk.
Sure, right. Yeah, no. There's a lot of smuggling going on, and this was in the ISIS areas and in other areas too. So the question becomes for the Iraqi government, or where did the revenues go for this? How do we capture as much of this as possible? And this has been an ongoing dispute with the Kurds about how much they declare they're actually exporting through to Turkey and elsewhere, and how much that they owe to the central government, and whether that should be deducted from their 17% and so forth. So that, they've been at this now for over a decade trying to work and sort this out. And there's a thought that if they could actually find a formula that would address this in a more transparent, open, predictable manner, this might actually help retain the integrity of Iraq. But they've been at it for 10 years trying to work out that formula, haven't quite found it, and that remains to be addressed.
Fascinating. So let's talk about another population there that is very important, the Sunni Arabs. Mm-hmm. And maybe the best thing to do with this is to just go back a little bit and remind us pre-2003, it was Saddam Hussein leading Sunni Iraq.
Sure.
In a predominantly Shia country,
yeah.
Right? And then where are we now?
So the Sunni community were the biggest losers from the post-2003 political dispensation, and in terms of being the leaders of the country from its modern inception, 1921. I would argue that post 2003, the United States and just about everybody else has been overwhelmingly focused on how to reintegrate the Sunni community back into Iraq proper. And they've failed, and this has been a question that's taken on an almost existential dimension in its, depths of its failure. And this hasn't been helped by the fact that many of in their communities openly sided with ISIS under a great deal of provocation, but felt that central government under Prime Minister Maliki was sectarian in nature, sectarian in practice, wasn't responding to their demands for greater participation politically, in the security forces, in the judicial system, and in fact would argue that he was openly forcing them out. So the question is, how did these communities get reintegrated? What political leaders will come forward? On what basis will political parties be formed? Now, the good news is that everyone's working on these questions, and both the Shia and the Kurds all recognise the importance of maintaining all of the different communities. There are efforts underway. There are national elections and provincial council elections next April, May in Iraq, and there are parties that are being formed that are reaching out across sectarian lines and differences. But while that's terrific, and the fact is that their towns are destroyed, and it's the Sunnis that are spread the length and breadth of the country, including throughout Iraqi Kurdistan, and who are, bearing the brunt of, revenge, sectarian attacks at present, and it's possible that Iraq could disintegrate. Okay, I mean that the amount of work that's required is immense. Yeah.
So, I mean, it's particularly interesting, speaking of ISIS, which is a Sunni group. So there's ISIS is not actually gone, which we should address. But also there's Sunnis who have to decide, will they go to ISIS? And if they don't go to ISIS, they're the biggest target of ISIS. Am I right?
Well, it is certainly, ISIS is not gone, and some people have been talking about, that there'll be ISIS 2.0. I'd really dislike that phrase, but that's how it's sort of been picked up and spread around, including by Sunni community leaders that are sometimes using this as a threat and a promise if things don't emerge where their communities get better treatment. So I think the allure of ISIS, either as a caliphate or as a genuine alternative to Baghdad or Damascus, because it happened in both countries in an adjoining Sunni area, I think the allure of the organisation is gone. And I actually
But is al-Baghdadi gone? It's
right.
Very unclear. I don't. There's been several reports of his assassination that I think are all untrue, but I don't even think the generals are 100% sure.
Sure, and I certainly, if the generals don't know, I don't know. But I don't think. I mean, I think the point I think is that the external recruitment is drying up if it hasn't dried up altogether. There's many Iraqis and Syrians who are, they're not joining ISIS, and in fact they're being constrained and restricted in every way, but it will take some time to bring in the remnants, or you could have a referendum on independence on the 25th of September, and give in all the disputed areas and give everybody a good reason to keep on fighting, in different ways. So one thing we can't underestimate actually is the personal sort of cost in all of this. If you're a 26-year-old in ISIS, you've been fighting basically for 13 years. Since 2003, you were 10, 12 when the invasion happened. You have been exposed to a lot of kinetic energy. Your cities have been bombed, etc. Nothing else. And we have to somehow create the Iraqis have to create the conditions by which these young men, become more productive in society. And there's a lot of them. The city of Mosul had more than 1 million. There's 30 to 40,000, 50,000 young men just out of that city alone that are in the category that I'm describing, that need, to be dealt with in some way.
Doing something different. And then there's also this fear of ISIS itself, that obviously a lot of it has been pushed down into Syria, but ISIS, the Islamic State, there's this projection that perhaps it will go back to being stateless, which could potentially present more problems, not just in that region, but outside of the region.
Well, I mean, it does. The Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa, two major cities where ISIS still has a large presence, are being heavily attacked now on all sides. So I don't know how long they're going to last, frankly. Some ISIS members are taking refuge in the open desert areas between Iraq, Syria and Jordan, and it's desert, there's nothing there. And these places, they may be able to move around, but it's coming.
You can't live there very long.
Coming back as a formed unit in any way just seems, very unrealistic at this point. So, yeah.
Okay, and then obviously the largest group, the Shia Iraqis. It almost seems like sometimes they get left off. They've been running the Iraqi army, the Iraqi government, and there's a number of Shia militias, some of which are Iranian-backed. So where do they fit in?
So there's a lot of developments there too. Some of them quite positive, but clearly the biggest challenge facing the government of Iraq is essentially how to manage the more than 100,000 young men who joined these popular mobilisation force militias. As you rightly said, some have got quite close ties to Iran, have Iranian Revolutionary Guard advisors attached to them, are along a security fault line sitting opposite the Peshmerga in different parts of Iraq in the north. Some have gone to fight in Syria. But I should say that there are many of these militias that haven't gone to Syria, that have some distance from Iran. You have both Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani and Muqtada al-Sadr, who are nationalists, who have openly called back or called for the militia, any Iraqis to go to Syria or elsewhere to come back to home soil. And then there's a very, nationalist streak among the Shia political parties as well. So Iraq is not going to become Iran, but they've got this very real practical problem of what do you do once you give all of these young men weapons and they've fought sometimes very bravely, and what kind of reward and recognition do they get? How do you absorb them back into a neutral political force, and how do you prevent some of these militias turning into servants of political parties and or seizing land and grabbing assets and resources like oil and getting involved in that business? So, yeah.
And I think there's a question that a lot of people have been asking with the U.S. support of the Iraqi military and the Iranian support of the Iraqi military. Is that a conflict? Is that? And I think it was a little bit more understood under the Obama administration. Now with a new Trump administration, it seems like that could get even more tense, and obviously not something that Trump, at least outwardly, would support.
Sure. I mean, this is the interesting fact of the fight against ISIS over the last 18 months, and indeed some of the other groups on the Syrian side at least, in the unlikely bedfellows that it's brought together. So, the US, Hezbollah, Iranian Revolutionary Guards, Assad regime, Shia militias, all not necessarily working together, but having a common kind of direction for what they considered the worst of all evils out there. Now, as ISIS, does finish or come to an end, what happens next? And this is important both in the Iraqi context and the Syrian context as well. And how do you deconflict all of these different elements? I think on the Syrian side, it's actually a little bit clearer, which might sound kind of counterintuitive in a way, but Syria is essentially divided into 4 segments now. Turkey looking after the north, the US looking after the east with the fight against ISIS, Jordan and Israel, and working with Russia on the south, and the Russians and the Assad government looking after Damascus, the rump, and the west of the country. That's a clarity that hasn't been there previously in the conflict, but there's the deconflicting of the hardware of the external patrons over in the skies above these zones is happening, and internal arrangements are being made that will stabilise these. So people are actually openly talking about the Syrian conflict ending, and preparing populations to go back to their areas in Lebanon, in Turkey, and elsewhere. Private sectors mobilising to get involved in reconstruction. That's a good thing. The question is who will ultimately take control of all of these areas and on what terms. So on the Syrian case, I think the current administration has made it clear that it's all about ISIS and then they're going. But then that means, these areas that are largely Sunni, Deir ez-Zor, Raqqa, etc., what terms do they submit or come under the control of Damascus again? And the same applies for these Iraqi areas in terms of on what basis they come under the control of the government in Baghdad as well. People are working through those questions now.
It seems I've talked to a few Pentagon reporters in Washington, and as you said, the answers that they're getting is largely we're against ISIS. No matter what other parties, Iran, Russia, anyone else is brought up, the answer is consistently we're fighting ISIS and that's it. Well, at least in Iraq, without ISIS, what will the answer be? Will we leave? Will the U.S. leave?
Good question.
Difficult.
So there's and I would argue that along with Iraq, the same question actually applies with this administration vis-a-vis Afghanistan. So what the discussion that's happening in Washington on the Iraq file is, what can we do differently that we haven't tried already, that we were doing between 2003 and 2011 when we were last in Iraq with a heavy footprint? How do we interact with the Iraqi government, political class, and the security forces, including the Kurds, so that ISIS too doesn't emerge? What mistakes have we made? Is there any way that we can configure that kind of support, or should we just cut our losses and leave? So I think some people feel that there's the US bears some responsibility for what happened in Iraq, and there's I think a sense among a lot of the servicemen and women of a commitment. There should be a commitment by the US government to remain engaged and try and help steer things on a stable path. There's actually a loud and clear request from all the Iraqis that I've been interacting with, including the Kurds, for the international community to stay engaged. And they feel that and I mean everybody here, but they feel that if they're left to their own devices, it's going to disintegrate. So that was a clear message from Kurds, MPs in Baghdad, etc. Yeah.
And yet Trump himself has spoken against nation building. Is that...
Sure. I mean, he says many things, doesn't he?
He does.
Yeah. Sorry. I had
so
to say
we'll
that.
see.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have some questions from you all. Thank you for helping us along. Give me just a second to read through these. Here's the first one. Is there any possibility that the Iraqi Kurds will work with the Turkish Kurds to form a separate Kurdish nation?
Great question. No. So the PKK, and Masoud Barzani are arch rivals, and the Masoud Barzani, who heads up the KDP branch of the Kurds in Iraqi Kurdistan, there are PKK elements along the Syrian border in Sinjar which are preventing Barzani's Peshmerga from going into these areas. They're putting quite serious constraints on the KDP Peshmerga in this regard. They don't want him controlling that border area with access to Syria and elsewhere. So not in my lifetime.
There you go, very clear. One of the few clear things. Will there become a point in the near future where there might have to be a revolution of a reevaluation of borders, or will the Sykes-Picot agreement continue to prevail?
Terrific question also.
Maybe remind folks of the Sykes-Picot.
Sure. So Sykes-Picot, a British and French diplomat, had a long dinner towards the end of the First World War, and on the back of a napkin wrote out some guidelines for where the national boundaries should be in the Middle East. It was slightly more than just a dinner, but you get the drift. So the consequence of the Syrian civil war and the Iraq war and the Arab uprising, and then the emergence of ISIS and the caliphate that it claimed in eastern Syria and western Iraq were the suggestion that these borders might actually change. And it was a consequence of the sort of all the policies that led to that moment that created this possibility. The sense I have now is that Turkey, Iran, and pretty much everyone else in the region have internalized the Sykes-Picot borders, or the borders that emerged out of the Treaty of Sèvres, and their nationalist politics are, contained within those borders. Some people disagree with that proposition, and the academic community is divided on whether borders will change or they won't. What my sense is, the international borders probably won't change. However, what is an equally important conversation is the internal boundaries and the internal borders. Questions of autonomy like Iraqi Kurdistan, questions of autonomy for the Syrian Kurds in the future dispensation of Syria, the question of Houthi autonomy in Yemen, and the fact that the Houthi didn't get an autonomous region like Iraqi Kurdistan was one of the reasons why they hijacked the process and went into Sana'a. The question of internal boundaries and borders hasn't been settled in Somalia, with Somaliland in the north. The question hasn't been settled in Libya. This is one of the big issues they're arguing about. This question hasn't been settled in Israel-Palestine, for that matter, if we're talking about internal boundaries. So that's huge, and that's keeping people really busy.
My sense
that's more of an issue, I think.
There will not be another such agreement, that if these boundaries do change, it might be on a more ad hoc basis?
Well, I mean, the advantage back then was that you only needed two people to consult over the question. That wouldn't work today.
No.
Okay.
Defense Secretary Mathis has said that the U.S. will keep troops in Iraq after the defeat of ISIS. Do you think this is beneficial for Iraq as they rebuild?
Yeah, I mean,
Try to rebuild.
As I said, I think there's an inclination to from the security and defence sector to remain fully engaged as much as they can. But that's going to be a difficult proposition to support if the Kurds have their separation referendum and then conflict breaks out. Which side do you support and go on? Because the US presence is on either throughout the country. This is a tricky business because you can't just go in there and say we're here to help you. Whether you like it or not, there's a legal framework by which these things are negotiated. You need that legal framework because it provides protection to US servicemen and women who go there. And the exit of American troops in the first place in 2011 was because the US negotiated with Prime Minister Maliki, and as a nationalist, he felt all the troops had to leave. This was done under the Bush administration. It wasn't Obama running away from Iraq. This was something that gets negotiated with every country. Now, the US troops that do stay in Iraq will have to do so with the blessing of the Iraqi government. And the legal framework and conditions under which that'll happen will have to be negotiated. But it's a real issue. But I mean, again, I think what makes this discussion so interesting is the US was there for 8 years with a huge footprint, with a lot of money, and what did it do right? What did it do wrong? What can it do now that it hasn't already tried that could make a difference here? There's a lot of sunk costs by the existing leaders in this country that seem to be running the State Department and most of the US foreign policy. It seems to be run by the Marine Corps these days. And I appreciate that they've invested a lot, but as with the Afghanistan question is, what can you do that's really different here that's going to make a difference?
And one of the questions we were talking about earlier, that it seems that the Trump administration is more inclined to do, is hiring out of the military, bringing on additional contracting forces. How does that change the dynamic in a place like Iraq or Syria post-ISIS? Is maybe in some ways there's less pressure but less accountability?
Well, I think I'm not aware actually of the trend swinging back in that direction. There have been a couple of suggestions by Eric Prince that you would have seen with Afghanistan about privatising a great deal of the support to the Afghanistan government and military. And I'm pretty sure that while that was put on the table in the NSC discussions in Washington, that they weren't picked up in the public, presentation of the president's policy a couple of weeks ago, which the generals are working on the details now.
Yeah, I think Eric Prince actually had an opinion piece in the New York Times,
right,
which he got some heat for.
Yes, yeah.
About that approach. When you were in Iraq, did Iraqis differentiate between these hired military forces and actual coalition forces?
I don't really have a sense that I mean, some of them are still there, of course. I mean, they're private contractors providing security to the US Embassy in Baghdad, to a lot of the diplomats from other countries in Erbil, etc. But again, the legal framework, I think, has changed quite substantially, in which they're doing their work in Iraq now. It's not the free-for-all that it was in the past. So, but they're clearly, on the logistics and personal security side, playing a role, vital asset protection and so forth. I'm not aware of them moving into other
areas,
operational areas.
It does seem interesting also, being hired by one country and maybe being nationals of a different country. It expands the circle.
Right, well, there's a word for it, isn't there?
Mercenaries.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, next question. Please discuss Iran's role, positive and negative. I guess there was a PBS segment about it. Saying that East Mosul was well off and West Mosul, East Mosul being on the Iranian side, I guess West Mosul was destroyed. How did East Mosul survive the destruction?
Well, I don't think anyone survived, actually. I mean, the level of destruction was immense. It's true that the right West Bank, much more densely built up, suffered more, intense sort of urban warfare. But none of this is related, I think, to Iraq.
I think there were separate questions.
Right, I'm sorry. Okay,
sorry,
right.
It was my reading.
Oh, there we go. Okay, so it was the nature of the city that kind of determined the level of destruction. And I don't think there were any favours intended in the way that the war was conducted. in moving from the East Bank to the West Bank, the left bank to the right bank. But it was brutal, and there are real charges of human rights violations, etc., against the US and against the coalition for how they conducted those strikes and so on, and some appalling stories emerging out of that requires this country's attention and everyone else's attention, because the same thing is happening in Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa. So I'll just leave that there for now because it is very serious. The question of Iran, of course, is is important on so many levels. Again, unlikely bedfellows in working with everybody against ISIS, and unlikely bedfellows with in different ways in the Syria conflict too. And of course the nuclear joint comprehensive plan of action, which the current president just said that Iran was faithfully complying with all of its requirements, which wasn't necessarily clear coming up anytime soon. From the Iranian perspective, they say, we didn't invade Afghanistan, we didn't invade Iraq, ISIS is Sunni, Al-Qaeda is Sunni, the Arab uprisings mainly impacted Sunni countries, and they see this as a region that's falling around around them, in which they're just filling a gap and moving into space without any evil intentions in mind. The Saudis are at Qatar's throats, the Qataris' throats. The Saudis and the Emirates are fighting the Muslim Brotherhood in every country, which is Sunni. So, the Sunni world's got a lot going on from the Iranian perspective. They see that working together with everyone else against ISIS in Iraq is a good thing. That holding back extremist Sunni groups in Syria is a good thing, and so on. Now, of course, there's more vested interests that are at play here, but it is in an interesting context, and they make some valid points. If you look at weapon systems and guns and who's got what, etc., across the region, and stack them all up, Iran and its groups and supporters and the rest, Iran's down here, everyone else is up there. Okay, so in straight military terms, the Iranians are less equipped, less powerful than everybody else. So what's going on? I would say that what a more interesting element that's emerged in this Sunni collapse and Iran filling space is that there is actually a genuine cultural hegemony that's emerging here. And I'll just a couple of quick things. So the annual Hajj, which just completed, had about 1.8 million visitors, and that's what it's been getting each year to Mecca and Medina, and of course hosted by Saudi Arabia and so forth. The parallel, there's a Shia religious ceremony called Arba'een, which occurs at the end of Ashura, which commemorates the killing of Imam Hussein, and where the Shia faithful from around the world and Central Asia and Africa and Pakistan, etc., congregate in Karbala, where the Imam Hussein's tomb is. And for the last couple of years, they've had 22 million visitors attending that fest. It's been growing exponentially each year. It gets a lot of coverage on regional TV. The public relations exercise around this is fantastic. And Sunni communities see this and they say, this was restricted practice back under Saddam Hussein. This was not visible, and it's becoming more visible, and we're getting, and it irks them. It's really an issue. Also, you have in Lebanon, very attractive Lebanese women singing the speeches of Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah. And it's fantastic video. It's kind of exciting to watch. And it's like, well, you're a young man, do you watch that or do you watch Saudi TV? But it's prolific, and it's interesting. So, and I had a conversation.
Do they actually win converts? I would be very surprised to hear Sunnis converting.
The aspect of the sectarian divide here, it comes down to two main things, which are basically new in the region. One is the successful insertion of Shia political parties into government, Hezbollah into Lebanese politics, the Shia political parties into Iraqi politics, overturning what Sunnis feel has been a natural arrangement prior to these developments of the last few decades. The other big issue that concerns them is this question of proselytization and conversion. So, and this is real. Now, there is a mobilisation arm on the Shia side that expands outward from Iran, and there's a lot of complaints about conversion of people from Sunni to Shia. I haven't seen solid evidence for it, but in Diyala and other parts of Iraq, but this gets Iraqis very animated.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. A real divide. And yeah, you mentioned Qatar and the Gulf. We should talk about how that has a role in post-ISIS Iraq specifically. What are their interests there?
So this is again a really serious challenge in the region, which after the President of the United States made his first visit overseas to Riyadh at the end of May this year, very quickly, a week later, the Saudis, the Emirates and Egypt and Bahrain accused Qatar of many things, supporting terrorism in the region, interfering in everybody's business, supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, using Al Jazeera as a tool of their foreign policy and embarrassing everybody, and so on and so forth. This blockade they blockaded Qatar, shut down Qatari banks in their countries, expelled Qatari citizens from their countries back to Qatar.
I know some folks in Qatar who are no longer receiving Saudi milk, but were happily pleased when it was replaced with the more delicious Turkish milk.
Okay, very good. I'm glad there's something good came out of that. But that's what happened is, of course, that Turkey and Iran stepped in and helped break the blockade or ease it. What is this thing all about? What it's about is that it's about the next phase in the region and who gets to decide what the policy should be and who leads on which files. Basically, the short version essentially is that what's happened in Saudi Arabia since 2015 until literally this summer has been an internal coup within a power shift within the House of Saud, where a single clan of the family, the Saderi clan, has finally taken control. And this transition began in January 2015 when Saudi King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz died, when King Salman stepped in and then went through the process of slowly elevating his own son, Mohammed bin Salman, ultimately to the Crown Prince role, which was something that happened over this summer. So in a way, what was very serious about Qatar was important, but there was also something happening domestically. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that when the first part of this transition happened in 2015, the war in Yemen started at the same time as the first transition of this family clan did. So that's the backstory, if you will, in terms of Saudi politics about this change. But broadly speaking, it's brought the Emirates and the Saudis together. And what they really want to do with Qatar is stop it having an independent foreign policy, have it stop its support for Muslim Brotherhood right across the region, have it stop its support for political transitions and election politics where Islamic movements can participate, which is what they see as their greatest threat, and to change the programming on Al Jazeera.
So the question is, how did the Saudis and the Emiratis win the Trump administration to their side? I will tell you that I spoke with a member of the Al Thani family in Qatar who complained to me that they felt that they were doing everything the Obama administration wanted from them, that they were following with this pro-democratic, open, free society that they were hoping for, and the Trump administration is literally punishing them for those acts.
Well, it's interesting that while the president did appear, President of the United States did appear to support what the Saudis and the Emirates were doing against Qatar. Rex Tillerson had a completely opposite view very quickly. And there should be no surprises there. Rex Tillerson, in his previous role as ExxonMobil CEO, spent 10 of the 10 years of the 21st century living in Doha, helping the Qataris establish 10 of their 12 major gas projects, which have turned them into the LNG global leader that they are. So he's got a pretty good insight into, Qatar and its role in the region. And there were actually quite some sort of interesting moments where Tillerson and the State Department came out most strongly and said to the Saudis, "What on earth do you think you're doing?" So there's a bit of daylight there between different institutions in Washington and who sees what. But I think that the wider reaction outside of Washington politics, European countries and elsewhere, have called the Saudis on this as well.
And what do they want from Iraq? What does Saudi Arabia want from Iraq?
So the without wishing to trash everything that Mohammed bin Salman is doing in Saudi Arabia right now, in fact, the Saudis have, and there's a positive dimension here, have started to re-engage in Iraq in a way where they've been absent for the last 10 or 15 years. They've opened up consulates across the country, Najaf, Kabul, the Shia areas. They're openly talking to Shia politicians. They hosted Muqtada al-Sadr recently. But ultimately, I think they realise they've got to be there and present if they're going to help Iraq achieve what it needs, which is essentially an enduring compact between all of its components.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to read another. Sorry, I've neglected your questions for a minute. Due to the constant war in Iraq, children have not been in school for 3 years, not to mention been fighting during that time, a lot of them. What does this mean for the upcoming generation? Will Iraq make education an important aspect of rebuilding?
It is a huge focus, and the schooling didn't completely shut down. I mean, it's been running in all areas that were, not occupied by ISIS, and Iraqis prize it. The humanitarian community is working with the Iraqi, education ministry to deliver this in the IDP camps and refugee camps. Everyone knows very clearly what it means if they don't keep this as a priority, and it is in fact, major priority for the government.
And also, another question here: Mosul is a commercial hub of Iraq. What is the economic impact? How does the country?
Sure. I mean, it was a major town, second largest city in all of Iraq. Huge and expansive, wealthy agricultural areas surrounding it, which have been lying fallow or mismanaged. I must say that some of this was happening before ISIS emerged on the scene. Bottom line is that all of northern Iraq and central Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan should be immensely wealthy. Commodities, agriculture, oil and gas, you name it, and it's politics that's getting in the way.
If the Trump administration sticks with its vow not to nation build, do you see other nations, other entities coming in to fill the vacuum to help?
So just to pour the concrete is going to take a number of years in these cities. The private sector in the region is gearing up for massive reconstruction in Syria, in Iraq, in particular. So I think there'll be many people coming to play that role, at least on the commercial side. There's a presence in Iraq now of Iran, Saudi, Turkey. I mean, they're the main players in my view, which will determine the future of the country.
Also, on the other side, the reports, I think I mentioned this a little bit, that ISIS is struggling financially. Is that true? Is that really sort of sucked the air out of this force, and is that continuing? What happens to ISIS? I guess getting back to the beginning.
Right. Well, I mean, they're, as a organisation that actually holds ground and cities, it's disappearing rapidly. It's kind of hard to conceive of circumstances where it's going to be able to regroup in any way, shape or form outside of, isolated attacks and even attacks outside of the region to seize and hold ground. I think that's behind us.
And that obviously seems hopeful because they were doing a lot of bad things, but also sort of hopeful, and maybe I'm projecting here, but that some movement like this could exist, and in a mildly chaotic transition period, at least in the American government, something like this could happen to keep something like ISIS from expanding. Is that hopeful, or is this a one-off?
Sorry, can you
say it again?
Yeah.
Sure. Are we better at destroying groups like ISIS, terrorist groups like ISIS, or was there a specific formula that can't be replicated?
Right. Well, I think that the gestation period leading up to the formation of ISIS, when it emerged in dramatic fashion in 2014 with the seizure of Mosul, the gestation period was quite long. And some would draw a causal pathway back to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and then subsequent policy decisions and choices taken that led to the collision between that and the Arab uprisings, the Syrian civil war, which saw in this moment, in this space, this dramatic organisation. Now, there's a sort of a very I would call it the rational current in the organisation, which was Sunni communities disenfranchised in Syria and Iraq. That was a big part of it, along with foreign fighters and so on and so forth. I think if people are in the business, or the Saudis, the Turks, and the Iranians can essentially come up with power sharing arrangements in governance that extend the capital's remit from Damascus and Baghdad to their existing international borders, the prospects for ISIS to come back will be gone. But I'd like to think that there would be, and I had many discussions with Iraqis and Kurds, a sustained internal discussion about the reasons why ISIS emerged and everyone's role in helping it come about. And one would hope also that there'd be the same conversation among all the international helpers of Iraq about this as well.
Well, that's great. I think we've gone through our time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amy.
Peter.
Thanks
this
very
is
much.
Amazing. And